The Denver Broncos RB1 for 2025 is not on the roster yet, or is he? We'll break that down here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it is your team every single day. For all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more every single day throughout the entire offseason, we got you covered, because for the true fan, there is never an offseason. I'm Cody Roark, credentialed Broncos beat reporter for Mile High Sports, joined as always by the longtime site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com, also writer over there, NFL Spin Zone. He is Sayre Bedinger. In Broncos Country, we got a lot to break down here on today's episode of the show. We'll wrap things up by talking about, will the Broncos go to free agency or the NFL draft to find their key running back for 2025? And we're also going to talk about whether or not the team's RB1 is even on the roster at this point, or will they be added to the roster here this season? We're going to kick things off by recapping what was a rough 2024 for Denver's running back group. We'll break that down here on today's episode of the show, brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And for the first whistle of the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Sayre, let's go back as we continue our position recap and kind of look ahead here. The running back position, if we had to maybe highlight any position on this entire roster last season, was probably the most disappointing in terms of production, I'd have to say it's the running back position.
No doubt, because you expected Javonte Williams to hopefully take another step forward after that injury back in 2022. Obviously, he made it back to the field in 2023, played a lot in 2023, but the results weren't quite there from what we had come to expect from Javonte. And so him entering this year as the lead back, we had some talks around a year ago at this time, Cody, about, is he going to get cut in the offseason? That obviously didn't end up happening. The Broncos rolled with him, Jaleel McLaughlin, and the rookie Audric Estime for the most part this past year, with a little bit of sprinklings here and there of Sayre Bedinger and then Blake Watson, the undrafted rookie. So a lot of backs, and I think the fact that the Broncos had 5 running backs on their roster at different times this season, including all 5 of them on the roster at the same time at the end of the year, I think is indicative of the problem. Like, there was just no clear solution at any point during the season for, hey, we can really ride this guy.
Well, and another thing too, we look at rushing touchdown production. Remember in 2023, it was brutal. I think Denver only had 2 rushing touchdowns in the span of a handful of weeks. How many rushing touchdowns? Somebody in the chat, obviously pull it up here, or somebody, wants to drop it in the comments. How many rushing touchdowns in total did the Broncos have, including Bo Nix? We know Bo Nix had 4. I know there was a game against New Orleans where Javonte had 2. Audric Estime, 12 total rushing touchdowns in 18 games, folks. Well, 19 games, you count the playoffs. That's not good. And that also, I think, highlights the problem here in which we're talking about this disappointing season. And look, Sean Payton tried to do the committee approach, and the biggest challenge, he said, every single week was trying to figure out how to get all these guys touches. We have talked about, and we alluded to it earlier this week when we recapped, obviously, on an episode of the show, what the Broncos can learn from the teams that played and won on NFL divisional playoff weekend. Certainly having a good run game, or having one guy who's an absolute dog at the tailback position, can make a world of difference. Or if you have 2 really good running backs that can hit the hole, see it, and then obviously make things happen. Denver's scheme in the run game has to evolve. I believe they're going to eventually have to start pulling the guard. They're going to start doing, pulling the tackle. Get some more power concepts here in this offense to get things going. But what disappoints me the most, Sayre, when you look at it, the Broncos didn't have a single running back on the roster go for 550 yards rushing. I mean, it was pretty underwhelming overall. And there seemed to be a question every week, who's going to be the primary carrier this week? Who's going to get the primary touches? Javonte, there were times where it's like, hey, he looks back. And then there's times where he went through, I don't know how many games where he get a handful of carries and negative yards rushing, or 0 yards rushing in totality combined. That's where his role started to fizzle out toward the end of the season. And really, it was Jaleel McLaughlin, who's probably the most efficient running back the Broncos had on their roster. But it was hard for him because teams knew how to stop Denver's run game.
They did. And Cody, to your point, I mean, that's been happening in both years of the Sean Payton era. So this year, Bo Nix obviously had 4 rushing touchdowns out of the 12 total that this team had. And then last year, Russell Wilson had 3 of the 8 total. So last year, it was 5 rushing touchdowns from running backs for the Denver Broncos. And this year, you had 7 between Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin, and then 2 from Audric Estime. So 9 in total. And like, look, that's not even a full season for some of the best backs in the NFL these days. You've got to be able to cash in when you get into the red zone. Your running backs got to help out. Like, they've got to pull their weight when you get down into the red area. And sure, you can have success in the red zone in a number of different ways. Like the Denver Broncos ranked 7th in the NFL in total red zone offense, but largely I'd say no thanks to their running game. Like, right? I mean, ultimately over the course of the year. So these guys need to do more. The success rate of the running back position has been abysmal. I know we had discussions about that earlier in the year when folks were trying to say, Bo Nix, I don't know why he's not doing this, that, and the other. He's got a good running game to lean on. That hasn't been the case. Like, Bo Nix led the team in rushing in 1/3 of the Broncos games this year, barely had a running back crack 500 yards. And that's not because, like, 4 or 5 guys are running the ball well. We got to spread it out. It wasn't the case. The Broncos had to keep trying different stuff all throughout the season and hope that they could find a hot hand. And it cost them in 1-score games. I bet if we go back, Cody, we do some film study on the 1-score games from this past year. I bet you the majority of the problem in those games is not being able to sustain drives. And how do you sustain drives? You run the football.
Yeah, and that was a problem. I mean, the Broncos offense was relatively pass happy throughout the entire season. And, unless you're like just in a consistent rhythm, like obviously there was the game against Kansas City where Bo Nix was 18 of 18. That was sustaining drives in the passing game. But you know how rare it is to do that. You have to have balance, right? And I think the elite teams, the guys that we see separate themselves, like, for example, I think the Chiefs run the ball really well, but in times where they need to come up with plays in the passing game, Mahomes finds guys, whether it's Xavier Worthy, whether it's Travis Kelce in the playoffs. We saw that happen. Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. They have a dominant run game. I mean, in their first 2 playoff games this offseason, they played 2 of the best run defenses in the NFL this year. The Broncos in the wildcard round and the Ravens in the next round, and they ran the ball down their throats at a consistent rate. And Josh Allen didn't necessarily have to use his arm in the passing game in either of those games to really make a difference in terms of winning the game. So in terms of sustaining drives, and we talked about it, heck, we saw it 2 weeks ago. The Bills dominated the time of possession against the Broncos because, man, they were running the ball effectively. And on top of that, they were connecting on some third downs. They were connecting with the passing game to keep drives alive, and it kept Bo Nix in the offense off field. The Broncos, and ultimately their defense will be better in the long run if the offense can find a way with Bo Nix, who was the offense for a large part of this season, to say, you know what? We're going to run the ball. We're going to control time of possession. Some of the Broncos' most efficient drives of the year, Sayre, were like 12-play, 13-play drives that took 6-7 minutes off the clock. That's where Denver needs to evolve to, but the run game has to be a support of that. They didn't have that with Javonte Williams, Audric Estime, Jaleel McLaughlin, Sayre Bedinger, or anybody really this year, and that's going to have to change if the Broncos want to have success. If they want to make it back to the postseason, they want to have, like they said, their goal is to win the AFC West. They want to win the AFC West. They got to be able to do that, and if they can't, it's going to be a little bit more of the same. So that's going to be the emphasis here for this team going into the offseason. And look, I look at it as well. You mentioned it. Bo Nix leading the team in rushing essentially, from a game-to-game basis over a third of the games, including your playoff game where he was your leading rusher. That tells you, I think, everything you need to know about where this team needs to get better.
Yeah, Cody, over the course of this last season, I mean, Bo Nix led the Broncos with 41 rushing first downs. And if you count all the number of times that, you quarterback sneak it, obviously that's some of the factor there, but like 41 is a really, really low number. And Javonte Williams was second behind him, Cody. So obviously Javonte led the team in carries, 139 attempts. Get this. 30 of his 139 attempts went for a first down. That's not even a quarter of the time. So, I mean, it's really, really bad.
What was his longest run?
His longest run this past season, let me see if I can find it. 30, let's see. I see
18?
20 yards from Javonte, 21 from Jaleel, and 21 from Audric Estime, the longest run of the season by any Broncos player. If we would have known it happened at the time, but in week 3, Tyler Badie, 43 yards. That was the longest run of the season, and it would end up being the longest run of the season between the Broncos' primary backs, Cody. 30 rushing first downs from Javonte Williams, 25 from Jaleel McLaughlin on a significantly less carry count there at 113, and then 15 from Audric Estime. So really, when you look at this, it's just overall efficiency. It's not the offensive line. I know that you have a lot of dirty hands and things. It's not the play calling. It's the backs. The backs themselves are not finding the openings. They're not hitting the holes hard enough, and the Broncos need somebody. So I think an overhaul of this position is in order.
Well, and another thing too that I think we should take a look at, what was Bo Nix's long run against the New Orleans Saints? Wasn't that for like 40 something yards?
That was
at that point?
So his long run of the year was 32, according to
So that
Pro
was
Football
against
Reference.
so that was against New Orleans, and I'm guessing there on that design. And it's just like, all right, like, you have Tyler Badie who broke one off and certainly has some impressive traits, but for your quarterback to really be your next guy that has the longest rush on your team, that's not good. It's not good enough. And now that poses the biggest question here for the Broncos. Is RB1 on the roster right now? Do they have a guy that can become that? We'll tell you why we think they need to go elsewhere here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting because right now new customers can bet $5 and you can get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. So if you sign up today as a brand new customer, you can go and place $5 on any of the AFC or NFC championship games this weekend. You can do a parlay, you can do player props, and if that $5 bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to keep the action going, especially with the big game coming up. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and a variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or you're looking to add some extra excitement for the playoffs, FanDuel has got you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL.
You don't need a crystal ball to know that whoever the running back one is of the Denver Broncos in 2025, they're not on the roster right now. And so what are the biggest question marks about the running back position that we have after what we witnessed in 2024? Well, everything. Who the heck is this team going to bring in to run the ball in 2025? That's what we're going to discuss here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But thank you so much, Broncos Country, for making us part of your day, especially those of you everydayers out there who make us your first listen of the day every single day. And if you're not already an everyday listener, hit subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts as well as on YouTube. Get us up in the top of your feed every single day and on your algorithm on YouTube, Cody. That's one of my favorite things. Pop up in the algorithm, hit play, you listen while you work out, drive, whatever. So do that if you haven't done so already and join the discussion here. And let's talk about it because the running back position was putrid. We just laid out some numbers for you. I mean, 30 rushing first downs from your top running back. I mean, I'm going to look it up, Cody, while you're talking about kind of our first question here. We're going through these roster series. So if you miss any episodes or anything like that, the second segment is always going to be, what is our biggest question at certain position groups going forward? And I think for the running back position, it's fair to say it's really everything, all encompassing for this position going forward.
Yeah, no, I would say you're spot on with that analysis there because it is a large question mark. Now, I think, can we maybe turn this into something? Let's start here, right? If everything is the question, where do we start? Is the Broncos running back room going to remain intact as it currently is? And if so, who stays? If not, who's going? To me, I think Audric Estime, obviously he's going to be back. Jaleel McLaughlin, I think, is a safe bet to be back. I think Tyler Badie and obviously Blake Watson, they're going to be back, on default in training camp, but will they stay on the roster when training camp and the preseason are over is the question. I'd say the one guy who probably will not be back, Sayre, is Javonte Williams at this point. And unless the situation arises like you and I had discussed, free agency is going on. There's a long wave of it, and his market isn't picking up, and there's no team that picks him up. Denver might be able to bring him back for cheap. But at this point, you got to ask yourself, if you're Sean Payton, who are we handing the keys to in terms of getting this Ferrari going? Because the Broncos have been trying to figure that out. The last time the Broncos really had a dynamic running back, his name is Philip Lindsay, to be honest with you. That was the last time. And Philip, as electric as he was, had his own limitations in terms of pass protection or tendencies. But, man, Phil was able to at least get 1,000 yards. Javonte's had some flashes, but, he lost 11 pounds in the offseason, and the hope was that he could get back to his rookie season type look, or even how he looked in his last year at college at UNC, and never formulated to that. So at this point, Jaleel, I think, will be back. Estime will be back. But are any of these two guys, in your opinion, the RB1, or do they have the chance to become RB1? Estime, to me, is the biggest question, because in the playoff game, that after you've gotten him some run, you bench him. It's like Sean Payton made him a game day inactive. To me, that was one of the wildest things I've seen. I didn't understand it. It was a little bit of a shocker.
It was. I think Audric is maybe that one guy that I would say, like, yeah, he's got a chance. He could go for nearly 200 carries, because I think that's what kind of the benchmark right now. You look, I mean, there's certain guys like Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Kyron Williams, like those guys are going to be getting a ton of touches. Like the offenses that they play in, like, are filtered through those guys. And so they're unfair to compare to, but I think like that roughly 200, or, give or take 20 here and there, I think Audric is that guy. I feel like Jaleel is kind of the ideal change of pace. Not that he can't carry a full workload, but he's a doubles hitter out there. He's a guy that, man, you feel like you put him in the lineup wherever, he's going to hit for good average for you. You need somebody that's going to eat up a ton of carries. And I know that you don't necessarily need a bell cow back, but let's just look at Bucky Irving, for instance, Cody. Remember when the Broncos played, I know that's a kind of what could have been scenario, obviously a mistake maybe in the 2024 draft. But when the Broncos played the Bucs back in week 3, remember, Bucky Irving was not even really part of the offense at that point. Like, we didn't have to worry about him. It was Rashad White. When we talked to James Yarko of Locked On Bucs, he was like, yeah, the running game is really struggling early on this season. Bucky Irving was not a factor as of week 3, and he got a little bit going against the Denver Broncos. Listen to this stat. I told you, Javonte Williams had 30 rushing first downs on 130 some odd carries. Bucky Irving this past season wasn't a threat up until week 3, week 4. He had 207 carries on the year. 52 went for first downs. He ran for over 1,000 yards. So that's a guy that just came into the NFL. J.K. Dobbins didn't even play a full season. 47 rushing first downs. Tyler Algier, the backup to Bijan Robinson, 137 carries, 43 first downs. Kareem Hunt signed off the street, 42 rushing first downs on 200 carries. So what we're talking about here is a baseline, just kind of like rudimentary level of efficiency at the running back position that is so missing. And that's why I think Javonte might struggle. He's going to probably have to take a prove-it contract somewhere in free agency.
Well, and to your point about what does this room look like, I mean, gosh, I feel like, to your point, like there are some teams that replicate the example well. Like you look at Detroit, they have an electrifying guy in Jahmyr Gibbs, and they got David Montgomery. They got a nice 1-2 punch. You look at the Baltimore Ravens, and we saw it this past weekend. You have, an absolute stud in Derrick Henry, and you got Justice Hill, who's that change of pace guy who can get you those doubles, as you had mentioned there. You look at the Buffalo Bills, it's James Cook and it's Ty Johnson. And to me, it's like, all right, now you look at the Kansas City Chiefs. Primarily it's Isaiah Pacheco, then you bring in Kareem Hunt. That's got to be the formula for Denver to be better there. Obviously, their personnel is going to have to improve, because I even think at times when we were watching the tape, you see a hole open up, but you see the running back not hitting. Sean Payton early on in the season had mentioned that too. And then I think he didn't mention that when the run game got brought up once again. He mentioned that, our backs have to see the hole better, because it is, with the zone blocking scheme, a lot of it is patience. It's, hey, we're double teaming at the initial point of the attack. We're reaching to try to get up to the second level. There's going to be a hole. Are we going to see it? When the backs aren't seeing it, then that's also a little bit of a problem there. So I think that's part of it, scheme adjacent, personnel adjacent. But to me, I don't think that the RB1 here for this Broncos team is on the roster. right now as it currently stands. I agree with you. I think Audric Estime has the potential to get there, but obviously it's proven based on what Sean Payton has done in terms of, okay, he went on IR for the first 4 weeks of the season. He didn't see as many touches going forward. There were times we saw flashes, but then he gets benched in the playoff game, the biggest game of the Broncos season, by the way. And it's like, all right, he's going to have a lot to prove here to Sean Payton going forward. I don't know what that's going to look like. Are there going to be any personnel changes from the coaching staff? Is that going to impact things? Definitely a question here. But I do think that we see Jaleel, Audric, Blake Watson, and Tyler Badie going into training camp. But I think the Broncos bring in a guy here to be their RB1 this upcoming season. And that leads us to maybe our next question here is, how will the Broncos address the running back position? I'll tell you why, and we'll get Sayre's thoughts on it, why the Broncos could bring in a player who has impact potential but is coming off injuries. We'll highlight who that is here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at Talkspace, and therapy is a game changer. It can help manage stress, it can help improve sleep, and communicate more effectively. But finding the right therapist and fitting sessions into a busy schedule, it can be a challenge. That's where Talkspace comes in. Talkspace, the leading virtual therapy provider, makes getting the help that you need easier, accessible, and more affordable. With Talkspace, signing up is simple. You can match with a licensed therapist who fits your needs, usually within 48 hours, and it's convenient. You can have sessions from the comfort of your own home, or you can even message your therapist between appointments. Plus, Talkspace is covered by many insurance plans, and for most insured members, there's a $0 copay. It's never been easier to prioritize mental health. That's one thing I do all throughout the year, especially dealing with stress and having a lot on my plate. Sometimes you got to take that off your plate. Therapy has been beneficial for me. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get $80 off your first month with Talkspace when you go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80. To match the licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80 to get $80 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code SPACE80. The fourth quarter action of today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is here. And all you everydayers and first listeners out there, make sure you subscribe and you follow and you pay attention all throughout the entire offseason, because we got you covered from position recaps to free agency previews, the NFL draft, combine, OTAs, training camp, preseason, and the regular season all throughout the entire offseason. It is year-round here at Locked On Broncos. So if you're not an everydayer, become one already. Sayre, I teased it before we got to this portion, why there's one player out there in terms of answering the question, how will the Broncos address the running back position here in 2025? There is a guy in free agency that I feel like can be that dog that the Broncos are missing, but there's an injury history there. And obviously when it comes to injury history, Broncos country is skeptical. Nick Chubb might be the answer here for the Broncos, Sayre, and hear me out. And I'm curious for your thoughts on this. Broncos country, hear me out as well. I think when you look at, obviously, Nick Chubb's injury history, he's had some big ones. I know he broke his foot and went on season-ending IR. But you're telling me Nick Chubb can come to a situation in Denver where he will be easily the best running back on the roster, and he's got the best training staff, which has proven in 2 years under Bo Lowry to transform the Broncos and players who previously had injuries or injury histories, and those guys made it through a full season, and Denver became one of the healthiest teams in the league. To me, this might be the way here for the Broncos.
I would be all aboard the Nick Chubb train. I'd be saying, hey, you know what? Let's Champ Bailey. I feel like that's one of those guys that you might let wear number 24. Nick Chubb is, I mean, probably one of the best running backs that we've seen over the last 10 years. And it's a shame that, man, injuries just suck, don't they? I hate it so much. I hate that part of the game so much because it robs some of the best players of some of their best years. And Nick Chubb was playing at the top of his game before that injury. I know it was early in the season last year in 2023, but man, the guy is good. And I would be willing to take that shot on a 1-year deal, especially if he's willing to do that, Cody. And that's really the story of free agency, isn't it? I mean, there is always going to be risk involved when you go to free agency, unless a team is just like, we can't afford everybody. This young guy is getting to free agency. We can't re-sign him. We're not. It's like the Draymond Jones type of thing. Like the Broncos just couldn't bring him back. He didn't want to be back, but it's similar to that, to where he's a good player. There's no like injury reason why he's hitting free agency. He's just hitting free agency. That's rare. More times than not, free agents that are hitting the market are guys who do carry an injury red flag. So you're taking a calculated risk one way or the other. Nick Chubb is one of those guys that I would say, okay, if you put together the whole list of free agent running backs and you set it in front of me, and I'm like, earmarking guys' names that I'd be like, hey, if the Broncos sign this guy, it'd be at least interesting to see. I think he'd be near the top of the list there. So for sure, when you look at free agents that would be worth bringing in, Nick Chubb would have to be near the top of the list. For me, this year's NFL draft class at running back, Cody, the more you start watching these guys, I feel like it's just loaded. So I think you could go for a Nick Chubb and then draft somebody as well. That's always my personal favorite brand of free agency is say, hey, let's get a guy on a short-term deal. If it works out, great. If not, we also drafted this guy. But don't be passing on guys in the draft because you signed Nick Chubb, right? That can't be the strategy. So when you look at this NFL draft class, I know the Boise State running back Genty, the Heisman candidate, everybody loves him. Will he be there when the Broncos pick? Nobody knows. Shouts out to the Iowa Hawkeyes, Caleb Johnson, Omarion Hampton of North Carolina. Do you double dip with a Tar Heel pool? There's so many guys. I know Chris
Henderson from Ohio State.
Yeah, Henderson from Ohio, or the other guy from Ohio State, Cody. The guy who's a cheat code on the NCAA game, Judkins. So Chris Harris Jr., I know, loves Devin Neal from Kansas, and there's so many other guys. And so what about the Arizona State kid? I mean, he seems like a Sean Payton type of guy. So I'm not up on the college football, the NFL draft guys just yet. Cody and I will get to that this offseason, but I love the idea of going after a Nick Chubb and then draft somebody and let these guys cook, stack the room, as Sean Payton said.
Well, and look, to that point, he said we've got to stack that position. And look, if you push some guys, like even if the Broncos somehow brought in a guy that suddenly pushed out Audric Estime, that's just how the NFL works out sometimes. I have high hopes for Estime still, and that's the one thing I would love to see him part of the game plan here. But it's like you look at a guy like Chubb, even a guy like Kareem Hunt, if you can convince him to leave Kansas City, to come over to Denver, Kareem Hunt, maybe he wouldn't be RB1. I think he could right now, especially on this roster, but maybe not, right? And then there's guys like Ty Johnson in Buffalo, or there's guys like Jordan Mason of the 49ers. The 49ers seem to have an arsenal of running backs almost every single year that you can think of. Even something like that to just upgrade it. But then it's like you mentioned guys like Genty from Boise State. Here's the thing. Here's the question I have, right? If he's available in round one, Sayre, I don't feel great about taking a running back in round one unless Sean Payton and that scouting department know beyond a shadow of a doubt this guy is going to be a legit game changer, right? We see it's different at the NFL level when it comes to tailbacks. Heck, we saw when Genty had to go up against Penn State in terms of just how different it is at times. The NFL is going to be an adjustment period. Is that what you need to do in the draft? Like, do you draft a running back just because you're like, hey, we think this guy can do it? When I think that, as you mentioned, this draft class has some good backs into it. And to your point, Broncos Country, we haven't gotten to that point yet. We're getting to the point after the Super Bowl. Sayre and I, we're going to open up the film. We're going to watch the tape of the Broncos positions we feel like they need in terms of scouting. And we're going to watch players and have a little bit more of an informed opinion on it. And also, we're going to utilize here experts on the Locked On Podcast Network to talk about some of these players. We'll bring them onto the show to be able to do that. But, man, I think free agency is the way right here, right now. And as we've seen, outside of Saquon and Derrick Henry, the depreciation and the value on running backs in terms of the contract market is favorable for the Broncos to go out right now and to make a move to entice a player to come. And let's not forget, if you brought up before, the Broncos this past offseason, they pursued Josh Jacobs and were not able to get him. When you look at a back who's similar style to Josh Jacobs, Nick Chubb seems to fit that bill quite a bit here. So that would be the most appealing thing to me. And obviously, Broncos Country, we want to hear from you as well. Do you prefer the Broncos to go the NFL free agency route, or do you believe that they should go the NFL draft route to bring in a running back? That is our question to you. At this point, Sayre, our final one that we're going to have here, Javonte Williams. We've talked about what we think will happen. Do you think that the Broncos should bring him back, or do you think that they should let him walk here in free agency?
I think you've got to let him walk. The reason to bring him back would be his abilities on third down. We did see added value from Javonte in the passing downs. He became kind of what Samaje Perine was last year, where you can rely on him to catch passes out of the backfield. You can rely on him to pass protect. And Javonte did a lot of dirty work that deserves recognition. I mean, for what he lacked over the
100%.
last 2 years in lead back, qualities, I think he more than made, and I can't say he more than made up for, but he definitely did his part to make up for it in terms of pass protecting, picking up blitzes, things like that. It's just an unfortunate situation to where the Broncos need to raise the floor at the position. And you'll hear me say that many times throughout the course of the offseason. And I just don't think Javonte is the guy to do that. He may need a change of scenery. And I think that's okay for everybody. Sometimes it just doesn't work out in the NFL. George Payton got a couple of all-pro guys from that draft class, so he's got to kind of maybe eat that one just a little bit, because I know he loved Javonte, compared him to Zeke and Nick Chubb coming out, and I think it just sucks to have to move on from a guy like that, especially because Javonte is not even 25 years old yet. But
Yeah,
at the same time, you've got to raise the floor of that running back room.
you have to find a way to upgrade the position right now, and I'd argue running back is probably the biggest priority for Denver in the offseason in terms of what they probably need to address the most in terms of cruciality. I don't even know if that's a word. We're making it up here on the show here, but Broncos Country, we appreciate you. As always, we're continuing our position preview. For all you everyday listeners, tomorrow's episode of the show, here's what you can expect. We're going to take a look at the Broncos wide receiver position. What do we learn about that room in 2024? Do they need to add another guy going into 2025? We'll answer that, break that down, and talk about how they can address it on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. We'll see you then.